Morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Wilbert Mukori. Welcome to this program. Tonight, I would like to discuss the issue as shown on your screen there. A report that the disgruntled Chris Msangwa discloses that Zanu PF has allocated US 15 million to destroy Chamisa. Money to be used to pay off infiltrators and judges. I think many Zimbabweans would not be surprised to hear that. Indeed, Msangwa is not the first one to talk of how Zanu PF has been spending a fortune to undermine the opposition. In the documentary Gold Mafia, one of the gold mafia operators there confirmed that while he was doing a similar job in Kenya, he was working for the Kenyan ruling party and using some of the proceeds of the looting to buy off the ruling party's political opponents. So this is nothing new. And certainly in Zimbabwe, when you look at the performance of the opposition, you really have to say to yourself, there is no other rational reason why the opposition has been so totally ineffective, other than that they are corrupt and breathtakingly incompetent. I'll talk of two instances, clear-cut instances. In the 2018 elections, Nelson Chamisa challenged the results, which went to the Constitutional Court. And in producing the evidence, proving or meant to prove that Zanu PF had rigged the elections, Nelson Chamisa's legal team came up with a real surprise. While the ZEC affidavits showed that there were as many as 12 polling stations which had exactly the same number of total votes cast for each of the candidates, spoiled votes, etc., etc., exactly the same in two or more polling stations. And altogether, 12 of those polling stations had such discrepancy. The rationale behind it was clearly obvious. ZEC had ended, the other interesting point was that in all those 12 polling stations, Mnangagwa was always leading comfortably. The rationale was obvious. Clearly, here was a case where Zanu PF was doing well, and when that polling station's figures were ended, they realized they would boost Mnangagwa's chances of winning if it was ended again. So in this particular case, we are looking at roughly 6 polling stations whose totals we entered twice. The obvious solution to that was to say, well, let's have a look at the actual polling station and their results. After each election, the ballot papers, all the records, everything pertaining to that election process is put in the ballot box and is sealed and signed for by all the officials involved and the election agencies. So if these 12 polling stations had identical figures, the question is, let's open the ballot boxes, the sealed ballot boxes of all those 12. And find out whether it is true. It was the most logical thing to do. But it was Chamisa's legal team who decided that they did not want to open the sealed boxes. The constitutional judges even asked themselves, why didn't you ask to get the sealed ballot boxes opened? And Chamisa's team was the one who came with the answer that they didn't want to contaminate to open the sealed boxes because that information was contaminated. How do you know it was contaminated without opening it? It was within their right to ask for the sealed boxes to be opened. And it was them who said, no, that we don't want to open it. It just didn't make any sense to anybody who followed it. It did not make any sense. Clearly, here was a situation where they realized that everybody will be saying, surely that is the rational thing to do. And once they'd asked for it, both the Constitutional Court and ZEC would have found it very difficult, impossible, in fact, to wriggle out of that one. It would have been impossible. And so this must have been one of those cases where the legal team, Chamisa's team, were instructed, no, let's not go there. That one, leave it out. What you should say if you're asked, why didn't you ask the box to be opened? What you should say is, I didn't want to have a look at the contaminated information in it. And in this particular case, since you are the challenger of the electoral process, everybody will say, well, okay, we don't want to have a look at it. So, by the way, it would have been also within the Supreme Court judges, the Constitutional Court's judges' right to demand that the seal boxes should be opened. Because after all, this was not just a case of Chamisa versus Mnangagwa. This was a national issue of great national importance. Free, fair, and credible elections are at the heart of any good governance. And so it was absolutely imperative that the truth should be uncovered. The constitutional judges themselves asked, why didn't you get the still boxes opened. And when they didn't get a satisfactory answer from Chamisa and his team, they would have been within their right if they were really keen to find out, to say, no, okay, we instruct SEC to open the sealed boxes. The information should be revealed. This is just too strange. You cannot have a situation where 12 polling stations have got exactly the same number of ballots cast, the same number of votes casted for each of and every one of the individual of the contestants. The same number of spoiled votes, everything identical in every respect. 12 polling stations. That is impossible. The only rational explanation is that these are double entries. But that is what happened. Chamisa and team accepted that. Right? That was a red line that they would have been told, okay, you've gone ahead with this court challenge. Please don't cross that red line. Don't cross it. In other words, the opposition in Zimbabwe has really been a Zanu PF B team in all but name. The most outstanding case to prove that is the opposition, MDC, and then Triple C. Failure to implement even one token democratic reform to ensure Zanu PF does not rig the elections. In 23 years, 5 of which in the GNU. Not even one token reform implemented. Clearly, those were other red lines. Gentlemen, you can do whatever you like, but we don't want any reform proposals submitted. They failed to submit even one reform proposal in Parliament. Not even one. So Mtsangwa's statement here that Zanu PF is spending a staggering $15 million to destroy the opposition. I think what he meant is to keep the opposition totally and utterly useless. This MDC Triple C opposition is what Zanu PF wanted. It is that corrupt and incompetent opposition that has helped to keep Zanu PF in power these last 23 years. Zanu PF wants the opposition. An opposition that they can control and will participate to give the regime political legitimacy. That's happened in 2023 and elections before. There is no denying that the opposition has been participating in these flawed elections to give the Zanu PF political legitimacy. Indeed, the opposition, some of the few opposition leaders have themselves admitted that. I have often quoted in some of my earlier discussions people like David Coulthard, who admitted in his book that he and his MDC friends contested the 2013 elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, knowing fully well that Zanu PF was going to rig those elections, knowing fully well that by participating they're giving Zanu PF legitimacy, but still they continued to participate because they also knew that Zanu PF would allow a few individuals in the opposition to win the few gravity seats, and those they found irresistible. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. That is the tragedy of what we've been seeing in Zimbabwe. The last election was exactly what Zanu PF would have wanted. A totally ineffective opposition. But nonetheless, participated in the election only to give Zanu PF legitimacy. All the other parties, organizations that witnessed the 2018 elections condemned the process as flawed and illegal, including SADC, the AU, and even Zimbabwe's own Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. But because the opposition participated, SADC found it very difficult to deny Zanu PF political legitimacy. And as soon as the election was done and Zanu PF had political legitimacy, some of those people who had infiltrated Triple C started to come out. And immediately there was a circus with all this recall of elected officials. Triple C imploded. Who benefited from it? Zanu PF. The faction led by Sengezo Savanko, the guy who claimed to be the secretary of Triple C, soon after the August election last year, and the man who has been recalling, they have now regrouped, and the gentleman on the screen there is Professor Welshman Nuve. He is now one of the three presidents of that faction of Triple C, including Tendai Biti and the lady Kore. Triple C has imploded. Zanu PF is the chief beneficiary of the implosion. I think the 15 million that Chris Musango was talking about now, I believe that money is now being spent on promoting Nelson Chamisa as the best foot forward for the country. This does not make any sense at all. Nelson Chamisa, like all the other leaders, including the gentleman here, Professor Welshman Nuve, Tendai Biti, and so forth, they were all in the GNU of 2008 to 2013, which failed to implement even one meaningful reform. And that's, to me, and to anybody with any common sense, That was proof beyond all reasonable doubt that these gentlemen are corrupt, breathtakingly incompetent, and utterly useless. And yet, somebody is behind the euphoria of promoting Nelson Chamisa as the best foot forward for the country. Some of the people who are behind all that euphoria, you say to yourself, this guy here is definitely smart enough to know that MDC leaders are corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless. So why is he so keen to make sure that somebody like that remains the face of Zimbabwe's opposition? The answer is very clear. A corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless opposition is exactly what Zanu PF wants. Nelson Chamisa will never implement any meaningful democratic reforms to ensure the elections are free, fair, and credible. And that is exactly what Zanu PF wants. So some of these people who pretend to be Triple C or Nelson Chamisa diehards are indeed double agencies. Zanu PF in all. They are just portraying themselves as Nelson Chamisa supporters to hoodwink the rest of the head out there that Nelson Chamisa is the answer, the solution to the nation's problems. When, of course, he's not. Nelson Chamisa was the one who last year was urging people to participate in the elections. At one time, he even claimed that Triple C was going to win big because I've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. When the evidence of the ground is completely the opposite. Zimbabwe went into the 2023 elections without even a verified voters roll. There was clear evidence that Zanu PF was frog marching voters, particularly in the rural areas, to attend the party's rallies. And come voting day, would frog march them to vote for the party. And then somebody insists, no, I've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. Of course, he was lying. Who benefited from it? Zanu PF. The tragedy of the situation is the implosion of Triple C is actually giving Zanu PF more confidence. They've got wriggle room. They know the opposition is not going to ever say something that would embarrass the regime. And they've recently launched this eviction of Zimbabweans accused of occupying land illegally. I think the main reason for that is the regime just wants to punish the Zimbabwe electorate for having rejected the regime during last year's elections because they know that if the process had been free, fair, and credible, Zanu PF would have lost. And so the regime is punishing the people. And there is a method in their madness. They are punishing the people now, soon after the elections, so that come the elections, they can reap They will be telling people, if you do not vote for Zanu PF, you all know that soon after the elections, you will be punished. And in this case here, the opposition is playing to the regime, whether we like it or not. This MDC/CCC opposition is nothing but a Zanu PF B in all but name. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. And the regime is spending a fortune to keep, not to destroy the opposition, but to make sure that the opposition remains as an OPF B team in all but name. It's a pity that the people, the ordinary people, have not been smart enough, diligent enough to realize what is going on here. The regime is spending all this 15 million US dollars convincing the naive and gullible voters that the opposition will bring about change. The Zanu PF B team in all but name is their team. They'll bring about the change they want. Even though that B team has failed to implement even one token reform in 23 years, 5 of which in the GNU. Yes, the ordinary Zimbabwean is being bombarded by all this information, and educating them so that they can open their eyes is not going to be easy. Because whoever is trying to educate the people will find themselves fighting a regime with a budget of 15 million US dollars. And given that we have got an electorate that has shown already that they're incapable of thinking for themselves, I think the regime has a head start. Educating the ordinary Zimbabwean voters to realize that the opposition, as presently constituted, is nothing but Zanu PF B team in all but name. It's going to be near mission impossible, because one is fighting a whole regime, a whole opposition, by the way, because I can rest assure you, the opposition, as it's presently constituted, even those who are not maybe on the Zanu PF payroll, they are benefiting from it. They see themselves as, this is my chance to get into power. A lot of intellectuals are actually supporting the opposition, not because they're on Zanu PF payroll, because they think as long as they can get some of those gravy train seats themselves, then they are set for life. Because they are incredibly corrupt. And in a country where corruption has permeated all sections of society, it really is going to be a tough job, try to educate the people, to make them understand that the opposition as it's presently constituted is not serving the ordinary person's interests. Because the only way to save the ordinary Zimbabweans' interests in Zimbabwe today is to elect a competent opposition that will implement the democratic reforms and thus finally stop Zanu PF breaking the elections. The opposition as presently constituted, be it the faction now being led by Professor Wolfman Nuwe or this other blue faction being led by Nelson Chamisa, which no doubt Zanu PF would be playing one against the other, uh, as long as they remain the face of Zimbabwe's opposition. Zanu PF does not mind really which one of them is the dominant one. But what Zanu PF would not want is a competent opposition to replace these clowns. So the present two factions will be fighting each other. Now that the self-destruct button has been pushed, I think we're going to see more and more fighting, getting more and more fierce and ruthless between the one faction fighting the other. And the only chief beneficiary, like I said, will be the Zanu PF, the real Zanu PF, the A team. The B team is meant to keep any other opposition from emerging, but at the end of the day, it is there to make sure that the A team, the Zanu PF A team, remains in power. That is the reality. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.